Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Aujourd'hui, je vous retrouve pour une interview, celle de Corinna Faith. C'est une réalisatrice britannique dont le premier long métrage de fiction sort aujourd'hui au cinéma. The Power est un film d'épouvante qui se passe dans les années 70 et qui met en scène Val, incarnée par Rose Williams, une jeune femme qui va faire ses débuts d'infirmière dans un grand hôpital et va se retrouver confrontée dès sa première nuit de garde à une coupure de courant général. Évidemment, cette nuit-là, des choses étranges vont se passer dans l'hôpital, qui semble être le reflet d'un mal gardé secret trop longtemps. C'est un film que j'ai personnellement découvert lors du PIF, le Paris International Fantastic Film Festival, et du coup, lors des vidéos que j'avais fait pour couvrir le PIF, je vous en avais déjà parlé, j'avais déjà recueilli les impressions des différents spectateurs, alors n'hésitez pas à retrouver tout ça ici. C'est une histoire de fantômes comme personnellement je les aime, donc j'étais très contente de pouvoir poser mes questions à Corinna Faith. Alors je vous propose tout de suite de regarder la bande-annonce, et ensuite je laisse la parole à Corinna.
Where are you from?
Around here.
Back to serve your community. Stick to your rank, never question an order.
Yes, matron.
I won't keep you if you don't fit. We have to move nearly all the patients out because of the cut tonight. You will stay on.
The dark shift.
Does the dark bother you?
I love working nights. You can get up to them all sorts.
What is that smell? It's like it's burning. Are you scared of something? Something chased me into the basement. When I looked, there was no one there.
A nurse must give of herself entirely. Sacrifice. How much are you willing to give?
Val, now listen to me. And you're sent by God to guide me. Be my light and walk beside me. Be my guardian and protect me.
Hi Corinna, you are the director of the film The Power, and we are going to talk about it. Thank you again for being here. Can you tell us a little bit about the idea that was at the origin of the film?
I was looking for a ghost story because I really wanted to write something that felt like a quite classic ghost story as my first film. It's an area that I really love. But I was finding it hard to come up with an area that felt strong enough, with enough depth to it. And then on the news at the time, there was some horrible stories breaking about institutional scandals here in the UK. And there was one after another. They just kept coming out. And I was very upset about the stories, and about the idea of all these young people that had somehow been lost in this system and demonized and blamed. And only now we were starting to realize that all these stories were true. The sense of those lost people felt like a ghost. So I thought, okay, this is good territory for me to think about for a ghost story. And then a lot of those cases were actually originating in the 1970s. So I thought it would be interesting to set it then. Even though this is all obviously very resonant now. But it's an interesting time in British history, and I hadn't really known much about the blackouts, but I was doing some research on that era, and I came across an image of a secretary working with a lamp, an oil lamp, and it was 70s woman, quite contemporary, but with this very Victorian Gothic kind of feel to her. And I love the combination of the classic Gothic setting with that era. I thought that was quite exciting.
Speaking about that, I was wondering if you had some of your inspiration from Gothic novels?
Yeah, I've always loved Gothic literature since I was really young, since I could read it. I suppose when I say classic ghost stories, that's what I really mean. I mean, the kind of, particularly, there's a strong tradition in this country, I think, rooted in that zone. So I've always been aware of that and immersed in that. There's always been a lot of interesting female writers and characters in that area as well, which is obviously very unusual for that time. A big influence on the film is a 1960s British film called The Innocents, by Jack Clayton, and that is again quite contemporary for its time take on the turn of the screw, and that's a big influence in general on the power.
Have you always wanted to do scary films, or was it just appropriate for the subject here?
Yeah, I think it was appropriate for the subject. I've always loved them, but I'm a film fan in many areas, so it's not my only love. But I do love the intensity of them, and as a first-time director, it's a very particularly interesting challenge because it's so technical. You have to learn so much about how to construct it, which I just enjoyed that element of it as well. Learning the craft, you have to do so thoroughly to be able to actually achieve what you need from the scenes. So it's kind of extra interesting.
Why do you think ghosts are especially appropriate for this subject? How did you want to use the ghost imagery?
I think it was two things. One was the idea of something really very present, very obvious, but everyone refusing to see it, which is like an abusive situation of any type in an institution. So probably collectively, we all know what's happening to some extent. And there's just a collective refusal to see what is going wrong. So I find that feels very much like a ghost story because only some people in those stories traditionally can somehow pick up on that or are chosen or can connect to something that everyone else wants to deny. And also, one of the central ideas was that I wanted the ghost to feel. This is a bit of a spoiler, so maybe don't share this bit if you don't want to. But the idea that the ghost is horrendous and the aggressor and demonic in its behaviour, I wanted to have a moment where that reversed and we realised that she was the opposite, because I feel that that's been the journey of how we've treated victims who wanted to speak, that they have taken the blame for decades if they dared say anything. And it was that moment of wanting to listen that I was interested in. So it was a kind of structural idea from the beginning.
Why was the hospital the best choice of setting for this story, and how did you use it on camera?
Well, in terms of the choice of the setting, in a way, it could have been an orphanage, it could have been a boarding school, it could have been a normal school or a church. Though these big, powerful institutions have all operated in a similar way. But there was a particularly big scandal here that involved hospitals of a celebrity who was a children's presenter, who was like a household name, who over the last 10 years it's become apparent that he was mass serial abuser, and it was all happening in hospitals. So it was actually a direct reference to that. But also hospitals are interesting because they have all the components of these institutions that can go wrong. So they have a very powerful hierarchy, but also the people in them are very vulnerable in a particular way. And you're supposed to care for them in a particular way. So I think I like the idea that Val as a character was going into that place with quite a pure idea of what a nurse is and what they can achieve and how she could heal people and perhaps herself. So I liked all those elements. Also, I just thought it would be a very good setting in the dark in a very basic way. It's the scale of the corridors, the fact that you've got people around you that aren't necessarily conscious, but they're there. I think that's quite scary. So it just felt like it was definitely the right one.
About corridors, there are a big visual elements in the film. Your camera really plays with the perspectives. So is it something that you planned on doing long before the shooting?
Yes, it was kind of pretty much written into the script that we wanted to achieve that. Finding the location was really hard, and it looked quite a few times like we wouldn't really be able to get that scale, but then we managed to find this location that we used, a lot more of it closed down because it is actually a real hospital. Just before the shoot, a lot of it stopped functioning, and we were able to access a lot more. So it was a very lovely piece of luck that we just got access to the scale that we wanted, because they are really, really long. I mean, it's only a couple of corridors. It's the same one, and we had to keep repainting it different colours for the poor art department spent. They painted miles of corridor over the time we were there, because it's actually a single story building. It only has one level, and of course the hospital in our story has many levels, so we needed to create the sense that she was moving between different zones. So they had quite a job. Sorry about my dinging, but yeah, I think it was a brilliant location in the end. It was very atmospheric, very historic, and the crew found it inspiring and quite scary as a place to work.
About colors, because you were mentioning colors, the color yellow in the light is very important in the film too, especially in the scary moments. So how did you want to use colors in general in the film?
The color was really important from the beginning. I made a mood book that went, a kind of visual reference book that went with the script, and it was all about those colors. I mean, some of it is simply because that's the colour palette of the time. And I thought that we didn't have much money for the film at all, but you can control the colours in your image if you're creating an environment. So I thought that was just a very simple way to create a feel of that era, because we couldn't afford a lot of props, or especially medical props are very, very expensive. So we had to be really thoughtful with what we put in the frame. But colour is available. So it was partly to create the period, but also I think the colours of that time, they're very interesting psychologically to me. They're very potent, kind of quite cloying colours, quite intense. So I thought they're slightly nauseous. And I love Rosemary's Baby and The Shining. The psychological use of colour in those films it's always been so impactful and interesting to me. So I wanted to see if I could do something similar.
The cast is essentially female. Do you think female characters have a lot to speak for through the means of horror genre?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I know that some people feel that it's controversial because there's been a lot of violence towards women depicted in the genre, and there's been terrible mistreatment of actresses in the genre to create some roles. On the other hand, as a teenager, when I was looking at who was on screen, it was one of the only genres where I was seeing women in a lead role. So I think that went right into somewhere quite deep in my head. And if I wanted to see women on a complex journey, really doing the whole story, that was one of the only places to look. So for me, it's always going to be a place that I think it's really interesting to explore the female psyche. Yeah, having women actually voicing the stories from behind the camera now more and more is obviously going to take what's interesting about that and expand on it even more. And people of all kinds, just diversity in general in the horror genre is really exciting.
Can you tell us about your work with Rose Williams, and why did you choose to work with her?
Well, she just did an amazing audition. She just completely nailed it. And I wanted somebody who was going to be a collaborative partner and resilient and want something from it very much themselves, not somebody that I was just picking, because it's an incredibly tough role. She's in pretty much every shot. I knew it would be very grueling for her to do, as well as exciting. And I didn't want to do that thing where you're just traumatizing a young woman to make a story about a traumatized young woman. That was like the opposite of what I wanted to do, because I was making this story very much for young women. And Rose really understood that, and we just had a very good connection, and we tried to stay close during the shoot and support each other, and I just tried to make it a safe environment for her to do what she wanted to do. I mean, it was tough, but I think we achieved that generally. And so I felt, as much as it was about her brilliant acting skills, it was about her personality as well, and being a really collaborative person.
And how do you work with children on a film that has so heavy subjects?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think you have to be honest. Obviously, you have to be honest with them and their parents about the content. There isn't anybody in that film who is so young that they don't understand what child abuse is. So it's not like you should be keeping it a secret, we felt. So you just obviously there's very little in there where they were actually seeing the full context. And actually, generally, particularly with Shakira, who played Saba, Shakira Rahman, she was a really, really fun girl. And in between all the takes, when she was acting completely terrified, she was hilarious and making everyone laugh and very light. So I think in that way that children have this incredible capacity to still use their imagination in a very fluid way, she could go in and out of those zones without having to go to a particularly deep, difficult place. She's just so playful still that it didn't feel uncomfortable ever. It was something I was wondering about and nervous about, but watching her, she was playing. But she and her mum were very well aware of what the story was about.
You said horror is not your only love in cinema, but now that you've done a horror film, do you want to keep on making some?
Yeah, the script that I'm writing right now is a horror. It is my own personal take on the subgenre of a demon in a house, and it's about the legacy of mother to daughter, and it has an older mother, a mother, and a baby in it. So it's about the grey areas of motherhood, really.
Okay, so female characters again.
All female characters. Not really deliberate. That's just because that's how my mind works. I definitely have more to say in this genre.
That's great. Thank you. That's all I wanted to ask you. So thank you very much. And I can't wait to see your next film then.
It was great to speak to you. I love your pictures, by the way.
Thank you. That's new.
Very gothic wall, isn't it?
Yes, that's all I love.
Very good.
Voilà, merci beaucoup à Corinna Faith d'avoir répondu à mes questions. Merci à vous d'avoir regardé cette interview. J'espère que ça vous aura donné envie de foncer découvrir ce film, qui est donc, je le répète, disponible depuis aujourd'hui en salle. J'espère qu'il vous fera peur, mais pas que. Et en tout cas, je vous retrouve très vite pour de prochaines vidéos. J'ai d'autres interviews là qui vont sortir un peu coup sur coup, et évidemment, je prépare aussi une nouvelle analyse de personnages et d'autres projets, donc j'espère vous parler bientôt. D'ailleurs, j'en profite pour préciser, en parlant de projet, que le 24 février, donc là très bientôt, je vais présenter une séance au MK2 Bibliothèque, et en l'occurrence une projection du Silence des agneaux. Évidemment, c'est un film qui m'est cher, surtout depuis que j'ai fait la vidéo qui lui est consacrée, et donc voilà, il y a potentiellement un ciné-club régulier qui se met en place avec MK2, donc j'espère que c'est une formule qui vous plaira. Si vous êtes à Paris, n'hésitez pas à venir. L'idée, c'est que je fasse une petite présentation du film avant la séance, et que après la projection, on puisse en discuter ensemble. Donc je pense que ça peut être super chouette, donc j'espère vous y voir nombreuses et nombreux, et du coup à très vite, que ce soit en chair et en os ou en vidéo.